everyone for coming. So we'll begin with some sitting meditation, and then I'll talk briefly on a couple points of posture that are helpful for sitting meditation. We'll do another short period after that, and then we'll do some chanting, and I'll talk for a little bit about Heart Sutra, which is what we'll be chanting. So let's begin by just kind of settling into our seat. Sit in a way that feels supported, that feels comfortable, a way that allows you to kind of relax into where you are now, your body as it presently is, in this space in which we're all sitting. And as you sit, bring your attention into your breath. As it passes in and out, through your nose or through your mouth. And if you find that your mind is wandering at all, just bring your attention gently back to your breath. No need to criticize oneself, no need to be harsh. Just kind of gently realize, oh, my mind is wandering. And bring it back gently to you. We'll sit like this for a few minutes. The reason that I start with meditation is because in traditional Buddhism that I practice, which is Soto Zen, there's an emphasis on sitting, and really just sitting. It's kind of the primary practice. And this practice was, and this tradition was transmitted from Japan, where it's very common that almost no instruction is given at all. And so we've adapted that kind of in the US. Many teachers do give instruction, explanation, introduction, but there's kind of this legacy of just kind of come and sit and figure it out yourself, which can be kind of frustrating at times, and that's also kind of the point. And so, kind of beginning with sitting and ending with sitting, and really all forms of practice in the Zen temple that I attend and other Zen institutions and meditation centers, is really you're sitting, and you sit first, and then maybe you talk. There will be some kind of Dharma talk or sermon, or maybe some sort of discussion, and you kind of sit again. And there's always this practice is always being good to sit. So that's why we're beginning with sitting today, and we'll also end with sitting at the end. Very helpful place to start with sitting is the posture. There are several body positions traditionally in Buddhism for meditation: sitting, standing, walking, lying down. Sitting is thought to be kind of the most conducive for practice because during standing and walking, it's easier to lose your concentration, your focus, you're more distracted on your balance, your coordination, lying down. Obviously, it's easy to fall asleep. So sitting has been kind of the primary way of meditating. And that can be done kind of on a low cushion on the floor, on a chair, really any way that your body needs to be supported and can be comfortable to meditate for periods of time is a good way to sit. So something that's very helpful is what's been talking to me as the 7 points of posture. And this can be something that you can work with as you're sitting, really at any time to help you focus on proper meditation posture. And so the first point is to be anchored. So kind of anchored to your seat, you're anchored to the earth, you have a firm foundation from which the rest of your body can be supported. The second is to have a straight spine. And oftentimes the way it's explained to me, this isn't like a military straight, but really to have a straight in that you have your spine as a natural curvature that is supporting your upper torso and your head. And oftentimes that means having your pelvis tilted forward, which can be facilitated by having your knees below your hips. So you think of kind of the traditional cross-legged way of sitting on the floor, your knees are up above your hips, your pelvis tilts back, and your spine curves forward, and that doesn't really permit your body to support itself. So the second point is the straight spine. The third is what's called the Mahayana Buddhism. And a mudra is kind of a hand, a positioning of the hands. In Buddhism, different mudras have different functions, and you'll see in Buddhist iconography different mudras that represent different things. I would say probably my understanding is that in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, the use of mudras is most widely utilized, whereas in Zen there's kind of one mudra, which is called the Mahayana Mudra, the Great Mudra, which looks like this. And the left hand rests on top of the right, and the thumbs are almost touching as if you're holding a piece of rice paper between your two thumbs. And that just kind of rests in your lap comfortably. And so that's kind of the positioning of your hands. And one way that I've heard this described, although I've never been able to actually accomplish this myself, is that you're holding the universe in this circle in your hand. Kind of all of the universe is there. So that can be something that's a helpful visualization potentially. So that's the third point. Fourth point is, so the fourth point is to have your shoulder blades flat against the back of your back. One way to do that is to have your hands out to the side and to rotate your hands so they're facing downward, but to rotate them only with your shoulders. So you want your hands facing down, and then you rotate so they're facing up, using your shoulders only, and then you can kind of flip your hands back down and put them into the mudra position. But that's one way of kind of getting your shoulder blades so that they're lying flat against the back of your back. And that's to kind of keep us upright and support the posture. And the fifth point is to have your chin tucked in, which opens the back of your skull, which I don't have a very good understanding of what that does for you exactly, but in yoga, there's a benefit to having the back of your skull open. And we tend to kind of let our heads fall in a way that kind of collapses in the back. So having the chin tucked in gives you that openness in the back. The sixth is to have the tip of your tongue on the roof of your mouth, between what's the hard palate in front of your mouth and the soft palate on the back. And then the seventh is to have your eyes open and downward at a 45-degree angle. And in Zen, the eyes open kind of represents that you're not shutting out the world, you're not attempting to take yourself out of the world, but your practice is very much in the world. And you can kind of open your eyes more if you're sleepy, or you can close your eyes more if you feel like your mind is racing and you're agitated. So those are the 7 points. I've listed them on the handout in the back for later reference. And really, I think we can spend probably years of practice just working on this posture as a focus point and kind of always bringing yourself back to it. And the idea in Soto Zen too is that sitting is the enlightenment experience. So there is no enlightenment experience or realization of Buddhahood that's separate from you or someone else. Really, when you sit, you are Buddha. And that there's nothing to attain. You're already there. You just don't realize it yet. And so this posture is kind of a posture that facilitates that awakened state and like sort of mind space and experience. So now we'll take another 5 minutes or so to sit together, keeping these 7 points in mind. So we'll again get in a position where you feel like you can sit for a few minutes. And then I'll just go through the points again slowly so you can keep them in mind while we're sitting during this period. So first, as you sit, recognize and adjust your foundation so that it's solid, that you feel anchored to whatever you're sitting on, anchored to the earth, anchored to this building and this structure that we're sitting in. Bring your attention to your spine. Look, it's straight. And another way of thinking of straightness is that your spine is straight from your perineum at the very base of your torso up through the top of your head and into the heavens. And then bring your attention to your hands and try this Mahayana Buddhism with your right hand on the bottom, your left hand resting on top, and then your 2 thumbs coming together, barely ever so slightly touching as if you were holding a piece of rice paper between them. And that can rest comfortably in your lap. Now bring your attention to your shoulder blades, laying them flat against the back. And this exploration of posture doesn't need to be static. You don't need to find something and stick with it. You can really adjust, and it's really quite beneficial to kind of adjust and work and see how does this feel, what if I do that. Now arm or shoulder blades flat. What does it feel like to try to press them in more to roll my shoulders back? What effect does that have? We're going to open back of our heads by tucking our chins in. And this kind of tilts the skull slightly down also. It's important when you tuck your chin in that your throat is relaxed, and your jaw is relaxed. One of my teachers has described this, if you're really getting it right, that it kind of looks like you're having a stroke, because your face is just kind of drooping down. If it's not there yet, place the tongue, the tip of the tongue on the roof of your mouth. With a soft palate and a hard palate beneath, behind that ridge. The hard palate. You don't have to press it forcefully, you just press it. Finally, adjust your gaze. Your eyes are open. Your lids can be kind of drooping to whatever degree you need. If you're feeling sleepy, sleepy or dull, you can have your eyes wide open. If you feel kind of agitated or like your mind is racing, you can have your eyes kind of closed. If you're really sleepy, you can kind of look up and above you at a 45-degree angle. Your gaze down at a 45-degree angle if that works for you. And take a look at all these different points of posture and see what's changed with the first couple as you've worked on the last couple. Is there anything that needs to be adjusted? And just as we spoke of earlier, all of this adjusting can be done gently, with kindness, with slowness. So the bell is kind of a useful functional piece where we'll bring it 3 times as we're getting ready to sit and once to end. It's also a symbol of our bells that we use in my temple kind of look like this. They're a bowl of some kind, some are made of metal. We have one that's very lucky made of crystal. But it's also a symbol, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we go into the Heart Sutra, but it's a symbol in that the bowl itself isn't what makes the sound when you ring it, but it's the emptiness inside the bowl that produces the sound. Without the emptiness, you wouldn't have any of the reverberations of the ring. So we'll talk a little bit more about emptiness later. So that's one way to look at posture, one way to look at meditation. There are many, many ways to meditate, and many ways to deal with the posture and to work on posture. There's kind of a convenient way to look at meditation in which there are kind of 2 basic types of it. One is a concentration sort of meditation, which includes mindfulness, it includes recitation of mantra or text, it includes visualization, it includes focusing on the breath, focusing on the posture. And concentration meditations have a variety of functions. Some are to increase mindfulness or awareness, to kind of embody whoever you're visualizing, to kind of sharpen your awareness and your attention. And then in Zen in particular, there's the second kind of category in this functioning categories is formless meditation or emptiness meditation, which is kind of fundamental to Soto Zen, where you're really not doing anything, you're very much so just sitting. And anything that arises, you just kind of be with it as it arises and be with it as it passes away, and not stick on to anything. So it's formless in that sense. It's also been described to me as an emptiness meditation, where you're emptying yourself of all of the noise of the ego. So you're emptying yourself of the content of your thought. You're emptying yourself of the activity of your thought. Really, those are kind of the first two that you're really working on emptying. And then once those are empty, there's a spaciousness that's kind of left. And you're emptying yourself of the spaciousness too. It's really attached to that. Like, ooh, this is nice, so spacious, and let us stay here for a while. So on that note, we will move out of our sitting intro and we'll move into chanting. So the handout that I've given to you, there is a title, there's a text titled Mahayana Buddhism, and that is the Heart Sutra, which we'll chant together and be talking about. This is a transliteration of the Japanese, so this is an attempt to put Japanese words into sounds using our alphabet. So I'll announce the name of the sutra, and then I'll hit the bell when I do that, and then I'll hit on this wooden block, which is alternatively described to me as kissing fish, these two fish kissing each other, or a Buddhist skull, which has a particular sort of effect when you bang on the mouth, which is banging on the skull. So I'm going to bang on this to kind of keep time while we chant. And so all of the, for example, if you look at the first line, anything that's separate is kind of said in one go. So the first line would sound like kan, ji, zai, o, satsu. So that satsu kind of is in one knock of the mouth, so to speak. We'll start kind of slowly, and then we'll increase the speed as we go. And, just kind of go with it. I know it's unfamiliar, and I know you have no idea what it means, and again, that's kind of the point. And that was definitely my first experience of chanting it, and kind of has been, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but kind of what you're chanting almost doesn't matter, but and we'll sort of speak to that in a moment. So, Makanya Radita Shinyo Kanji Zai Ho Satsu Kyo Jen Hanya Radita Shisho Ken Go Wan Do and Sai Gu Yaku Shari Shi Shi Fu Mei Fu 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 Shi Shi Fu Zai Gu Fu So Zai Shi Fu So Gao Shi Gao Fu Gao Zai Shai Zai Shou Ho Fu So Fu Shou Fu Metu Fu 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 Zhou Fu Zhou Fu Ren Zai Go Fu Shi Fu Zhou So Gao Shi Fu Ni Zai Shi Fu Shi Shou Ho Ni So Ho Mu Gen Shi Mu Ren Shi Kai Ho Mu Yo Yo Mu Mu Yo Shin Nai Shi Mu Ro Shi Yo Mu Ro Shi Shin Mu Ho Shou Metu Mo Mu Chi Yo Mu Ho Ren Mu Shou To Mo Mu Lai Van Yang Ra Mi Ta Ho Shin Mo Te Yo Mo Te Yo Mo Mu Fu 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 Wan Mei Sai Fan Go Mu Su Fu Yo Ne Lang San Zai Shou Tu Van Yang Ra Mi Ta Ho Tu Ra No Ta Ra San Go And after we chant the Heart Sutra, we always dedicate the merit generated by this practice. Chanting the Heart Sutra, copying the Heart Sutra need to be very generate a lot of positive merit, a lot of positive karma. And so we always dedicate it to all the ancestors that have transmitted the teachings to the present day, to future Buddhism teachers, and to all beings in the world. So we dedicate merit generated by this practice to all beings that they may benefit and that they may realize the Buddha way. We won't go over the English translation kind of word for word in this talk, but I did want to give it to you so that you could look through it. And it is kind of what seems to be considered one of the most accessible English translations in terms of for people who aren't familiar with Buddhism or Buddhist terms. A lot of terms that are otherwise taken or left in the original form are translated here. And so it's a good one to have. And we'll kind of talk about some of the differences between this and some older translations a little bit. But Heart Sutra, which is short for the Sutra on the Heart of Realizing Wisdom Beyond Wisdom, is important because it kind of captures the essence of Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana developed around the 1st century CE in India. It was about 500, 600 years after the Buddha. And so it kind of developed out of dissatisfaction with the teaching of the times, and kind of had its own sort of history of being polemical, which we've seen in kind of all religions that have developed throughout the world. It's an effort to separate itself from everybody else. It ends up turning into battles and fighting and that sort of thing. But Mahayana really focuses on a couple themes which are really core to the sutra. And one reason why the sutra is so important for Mahayana is that it's short, it's concise, and it kind of is viewed as containing the essence of Mahayana teaching. And there are also a couple aspects to it that made it really popular, in particular in China and later in Japan, I can talk about later too. So a few of those themes are the invocation of Avalokiteshvara, which is in the first line we see Avalokiteshvara becomes all to awaken. And Avalokiteshvara is a bodhisattva of compassion. In China, that bodhisattva is known as Guanyin, is depicted as a woman. And often treated as a goddess in a lot of Chinese culture as well. That's not Buddhist. There are a lot of non-Buddhist Chinese people that worship Guanyin. And so Avalokiteshvara becomes all to awaken. It's a kind of one way of defining what a bodhisattva does. A bodhisattva is someone who reaches an enlightened state and chooses to be reborn into the world, to kind of save all beings or to help all beings get to Buddhahood. And so here, Avalokiteshvara is interesting because being the bodhisattva of compassion, there is a bodhisattva of wisdom also. And so kind of the idea is that compassion and wisdom are really inseparable, that they're not two different things, and that they're fundamentally the same practice, and they kind of develop out of the same practices. Another piece is, which it makes, so that kind of that opening invocation goes from, it's kind of the first 6 lines down to O Shariputra. And then really the core of the text from O Shariputra almost to the end is really talking about viewing the world in terms of emptiness, or these translators will use boundlessness. And so boundlessness is kind of more accessible, because emptiness in our culture has this context of deficient emptiness, if there's some kind of deficiency or lacking. And in a way, that's because the ego struggles to comprehend emptiness that isn't lacking. It needs to be full. And that's why when you sit and you quiet your mind, there's thoughts flying out of nowhere that are planning things that you thought were done in your life, or you're coming up with your grocery list. You know, the ego has a really hard time being in stillness. So it tries to fill that stillness to perpetuate itself. And so there's kind of this fundamental relationship with emptiness. Is like, of course, emptiness is efficient. It's frightening and it's scary and it's lacking. But in this context, emptiness and boundlessness really means empty of a separate existence. That the emptiness and boundlessness here means that we're not really separate. As individuals, separate from one another, we're not separate from the pews that we're sitting on, we're not separate from the beings that we eat for nourishment, we're not separate from it. And it's just kind of an illusion of the world that there is apparent separations. When I touch this podium, I feel something that feels different from my hands. And I look at my hands and they look really different from what this podium is made of. And so there's an apparent difference and separateness, but the Mahayana teaching of emptiness and boundlessness, which comes from the Sanskrit shunyata, which can be translated literally as zeroness, is that there isn't a separate anything. There's really it could be argued that there's a oneness, or that it's just that there's an emptiness of an ultimate existence at all. So that's kind of a very, it's very core to Mahayana and to Zen, and it's also very complicated and difficult to grasp. And that's kind of what really the core of this sutra is about. And then the final piece is this recitation of the mantra at the very end, which I capitalize. And mantras are kind of a magical spell, in a way. They're words that are believed to have power beyond their content, beyond the meaning. So the sound of the word, saying the word groups, reciting the word over and over in groups of words together are believed to have a certain amount of power in them. Om Mani Padme Hum is probably the most widely known mantra, and that's the mantra of Bhagavad Gita. Compassion is really the speaker of this sutra. So here the mantra is Gate Gate, Para Gate, Parasam Gate, Bodhisvaha. And it can be translated, but it's very typically not. It's left as it is because the meaning doesn't matter. It's the power of the word itself that's important. And that's incredibly important. It becomes really important in China and Japan, and probably why this sutra became so popular, because there is a strong belief in the power of mantra and the power of chanting and what it can do for us, American brains. So this Heart Sutra is considered part of a larger body of texts called the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which is a perfection of wisdom beyond wisdom sutras. And these arose around the same time as Mahayana did in India, and it's really a much larger body of work. The Heart Sutra could be thought as kind of that, the core of that distilled down into a really short, concise text. So those texts, the Prajnaparamita texts, were first translated into Chinese around the 2nd century. And then in the 5th century, Kumarajiva, who was a monk in China, translated them again from Sanskrit. And that's kind of that 5th century translation is kind of the core of what was built after it and the core of our current form of this text. And so kind of a little bit about the traditional attribution of this text, which gets kind of complicated, and is one reason why I wanted to speak about it today, is it's intimately entwined with the life of Xuanzang, who was a Chinese monk in the 7th century, who studied in China when he was younger and was kind of dissatisfied with what was available to him. He thought, there are greater philosophical questions here that cannot be answered, that I think that the answer should be there as part of our philosophical history, but the teachers in China don't have access to it. So Xuanzang decided to go to India, which was no small feat in the 7th century, and undertook what eventually came to be a 16-year journey. A large part of that was in India studying. But he as he was beginning his journey, he was in the western region of Shu, which is kind of modern-day Sichuan, about that area in western China. when he came across a monk who was poor, starving, and was just kind of festering with body wounds. And he wanted to help this monk and felt moved to help him, so they went together to the local monastery, and there was funds there to have this monk fed and clothed. And out of thanks, this no-name monk gave the Heart Sutra, taught him the Heart Sutra, and Xuanzang, over his 16-year travel period, kind of studied it, recited it, and while he was in India, kind of continued to kind of dig deeper into the sutra, and later on, once he got back into China, he translated the sutra into Chinese from Sanskrit, which I know is a little confusing, and I'm going to leave it confusing for a moment and come back to it. And it was Xuanzang's translation that became widely disseminated throughout China, into Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and ultimately the rest of the world. And so kind of his search for the truth is sort of what led us to this acquiring of the Heart Sutra. And kind of traditionally, it was attributed to Xuanzang had discovered it in India, but the pieces didn't necessarily fit together. So in 1992, a U.S. scholar named Jen Nadir, she just shook the whole thing up. She basically said this is an apocryphal text that originated in China. And this is hugely problematic for all of the people in China and Japan that have revered this text for millennia, one millennium plus some. Because if it's not from India, then it's not authentic. Their tradition held that any Buddhist texts that were authentic had to come from India. They couldn't originate in China. And so for the scholars, you have scholars say this was a Chinese originated document, and it just set kind of the world aflame. A leading scholar in Japan was like, she's full of it, it's not, her support is not well founded. And kind of what her support was first of all, there's no thus have I heard at the beginning of the text, which thus have I heard, so the sutras are supposed to be the words of Buddha. And so thus have I heard means that there was a disciple or a student of some kind that heard the words of Buddha, and usually tells the place of the hearing and gives you some context. This text does not have thus have I heard. Also, it doesn't have Buddha. So the sutras are supposed to be the sayings of Buddha. In this text, Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, is actually speaking. So there's no Buddha, there's no thus have I heard. Avalokiteshvara is not prominent in any of the other question department scripture or literature. This Bodhisattva does not play significant roles. What should you be doing? There's this aspect of the mantra at the end, which is very atypical for sutras to close with mantra. And then there's other comparative evidence, like the Sanskrit versions that we have currently, that appear to come later than these earlier Chinese translations. So she said it's not original to India. And what she said is Xuanzang back-translated it. So he kind of came up with it in Chinese and back-translated it into Sanskrit and translated it again to kind of provide an authoritative, that this text was authoritative. So, what do we do with this? In kind of theology, Christian theology, and other traditions, and in modern Buddhist scholarship, there's kind of a track of this sort of work, right? Saying this kind of critical modern scholarship saying all of the tradition of where this came from is BS. These people didn't, the people who wrote it didn't write it. It wasn't written at the time that it was said it was to be written. So kind of what do we do with this? And Kazuaki Tanahashi, who's a Japanese, he lives in America, and he's a scholar, translator, teacher of Zen. I have his book out back, and I kind of owe a large debt of gratitude to him because I based my talk mostly on his work. He proposes that, he kind of proposes a middle way of believing tradition and kind of going with this modern critical scholarship stance. And so he says, what he thinks happened, or kind of proposes, was that the Heart Sutra was compiled by an anonymous Chinese monk around the 7th century. And he says compiled because he really was drawing from things that already existed. He didn't make anything up. It really drew its core from this greater Prajnaparamita work, which is from India, and kind of threw in some Chinese elements that were really important to Chinese Buddhists at the time. And one of those is Avalokiteshvara, was widely revered, and that's why Avalokiteshvara is in there. And then the core part of this translation of the Sanskrit text of the Mahayana teaching, and then finishing it with the mantra, which was also really important in Chinese Buddhist practice. And so this kind of monk saw, well, this is the core of the teaching, and here's the core of what Chinese Buddhists value. And so they kind of compiled the Heart Sutra in that way. Xuanzang received that version from this anonymous monk that's in his biography about Xuanzang. And then he went searching for a Sanskrit version as part of his journey in the film. And so either in India or elsewhere, Xuanzang kind of prayed to Avalokiteshvara and kind of asked Avalokiteshvara, please, give me this original text. And then Xuanzang received the text from Avalokiteshvara during a mystical experience, a meditation experience. And if it happened in India, then that would make it authoritative according to tradition. And it may or may not have no evidence that that's how it happened, although there is later description in texts that say, Xuanzang did receive the text from Avalokiteshvara. And then after his 16-year sojourn, Xuanzang returned to China, translated the received Sanskrit version, and disseminated his translation, which became more popular than the original version that the anonymous monk had compiled and that Xuanzang received from the Lord monk. And so that's kind of, Tanahashi's answer to this, and I really like the approach. I really like the approach because I feel like modern critical scholarship can have this kind of postmodern, skeptical deconstruction for the sake of deconstruction, which kind of leaves us with well, what do we do with this as spiritual practitioners? Like, well, what good is it for me if all of these texts that I consider sacred, or in some degree, or some means have some kind of connection to some greater truth or divine, and all of a sudden people are just coming along and saying, no, just some people here wrote it and it didn't really matter, or it's just about the context of the time, or all of what we've told ourselves in tradition is false. That kind of leaves you feeling, not very good about the texts or their authority, I guess, to teach us. So I really like Tanahashi's approach here to really kind of find a middle path between modern scholarship and tradition. We're not just believing it because it's what we were told, we're using our modern scholarly tools, but at the same time, there's value in the tradition and myth. There's one scholar, John McRae, who I haven't widely read, but he has a book called Seeing Through Zen, which is very much a debunking sort of text. But he argues that it's not important there, so all of this Zen lineage and all of these teachings of kind of who taught what and where aren't true, and therefore they're more important. And it's kind of interesting to think about that tradition and myth and the way that some of these things circulate, that there's a lot of value there as well. So at this point, we have about 15 minutes left. I'd like to open up for any sort of discussion, comments, questions that anybody has.
So I'll just make a comment. This is lovely, and this it's super interesting to hear what you said about the historical person. I went to Tibetan, so he, it's a big part of his. It came through him, so obviously from China to Vietnam. Super interesting. It's so much. I have so much of this. And whether or not it's
Thank you. It's kind of that. It's just an interesting question. It doesn't matter. Does that question even matter? Which is sort of, like the mantra. What do these words mean? It must matter. Or who wrote this? It's not authentic. People kind of give value to Does that change it for you? How important it is for you? Whether what any of these people say.
Earlier in the talk, something you saying that it doesn't necessarily matter the interpretation of the translation. Referring to this authenticity or referring to that when words are chanted, that it takes on a meaning of itself.
Sure. Yeah, I was specifically referring to the mantra, but you can kind of, I think it's a useful method to explore other things as well. In so much that it's helpful to think of it in terms of Zen koan. And koans are, can be thought of as riddles, but they're really more than riddles. And the function of a koan is to push past your conceptual cognitive mind in a way that kind of causes it to fail or self-destruct or break down. And then you have an insight or a realization in that moment where you just have exhausted all possible ways of thinking about it. And then the truth kind of reveals itself. And so I kind of think of it in that way of like, sure, it's nice to know what those words mean, and also at the same time to value the not known, or to value kind of the non-conceptual power of the words. And it kind of, I guess I view it similarly too, it's interesting, in other countries, I think the US is fairly unique in how we chant our Heart Sutra in Japanese, but most of other countries just chant in their own language. But it kind of has that same quality to it, that when you chant it in Japanese, you don't really know what it's about. And yet it can still have power, and it can still move you in a way, or reveal truth to you in a way that perhaps chanting it in English does not. And it's interesting, at our temple we chant, three of our chants are in Japanese transliterated, and then 2 are in English. And I don't know how that tradition, I don't know who decided what would be chanted in what language, but I find that it's kind of a nice blend to have, where, after having chanted the Heart Sutra for 2 years without knowing English, studying English now, it has a different sort of effect than how I've known me from the beginning. So kind of regarding the question is, I think the mantra is kind of the core of what I was referring to, but it does seem to have some value applied beyond that. Yes.
Can you speak a little bit to how the sutra relates to the transmission outside of Buddhism, that understanding?
That's a good question. Oh, sure. So the question was, how does this sutra relate to the transmission outside of words that is important to Zen? Is that what you said? So there's kind of this idea in Zen of a direct transmission. Zen really prizes and puts great importance on direct lineage of teachers from Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, to the present day. So when I took monks vows in December, I received a lineage document that has Shakyamuni on it and all the names between Shakyamuni and myself. And so there's kind of interesting problems with that, of course. If you think about apostolic succession in Christianity that had that sort of, that gave power to bishops in a way that traced back to the apostles. There are those difficulties with that, and yet it's still very much a part of Zen. And so there's this concept of direct transmission, which is face-to-face transmission, which is a recognition. The way that it's been described to me is that it's a recognition of the teacher that the person receiving the transmission has some degree of grasp of the authentic teaching. And so it's person to person in that it can only be done person to person because when you're with someone, there's something happening that is beyond words. And also, it does happen in the context of words. So, before I knew much about direct transmission, I kind of imagine, like a teacher putting their head to their student, it was like a brain zap kind of thing, like, you have the Dharma now. And I feel like it's really more nebulous than that. We do use our words, When I'm sitting, I often will use words internally to either label thoughts or to work through emotions or something like that. And yet, the words are limited. They have a limited sort of use, I guess. And so I realize also that I'm kind of speculating for myself because I'm not clear what the relationship is between the sutra and that sort of transmission. So it's helpful for me to be clear to say that. And I don't really know what the connection or the relationship is. And so I'm kind of speculating in the space of, from my experience, what might it be. I would wonder if you read through the English, it's really, and it can actually, when you use the kind of older translations of emptiness, it can really almost feel sort of depressing. Because it's like, it basically shuts down all of what we're doing, right? No suffering, no arising, no cessation, no path. That's like no formable truths, which are the core of Buddhism, right? No wisdom, no attainment. So that's kind of the top paragraph on the back page at the very bottom. It is free of suffering, arising, cessation, and path. And the traditional rendering of that is no. No suffering, no arising of suffering, no cessation of suffering, no old age and death, no end of old age and death. There's no wisdom, there's no path, there's nothing. And so I think in that regard, the sutra does have the power to move beyond words, in that it's really a very much is kind of giving you an experience of emptiness, of kind of that boundlessness that moves you into that space, that I think the transmission occurs in that space too. Any final questions? Great, well, we have about 5 minutes, so why don't we sit again together for 5 minutes. This time I'll ring the bell to start us and finish us. And this time, I would kind of ask that you go where you want to go with this period of sitting. If something stood out to you in the talk or in the sutra, you can have hold that in your mind as a point of concentration. If you want to try some formless or emptiness meditation, empty yourself of thought, just being aware of what passes through you. If you want to focus on posture. So just kind of settle in again. And these last few minutes, do whatever work arises that feels like it's the right thing to do.
that answer?